We like to watch shows like Narcos and marvel at the hardcore world of cartels, but there's nothing badass or cool about cartel kingpins. We shouldn't glorify people like Pablo Escobar or El Chapo. They're real-life monsters who took pleasure in torturing and killing their enemies. Sometimes they even kill innocent women and children as a way to punish a rival cartel member or police officer who refuses to do their bidding. Let's explore the most brutal ways El Chapo punishes his enemies, but be warned, the following video discusses very graphic details of torture and murder. In the world of drug cartels, violence and reaching the top are closely intertwined. The more brutal you are, the more you intimidate your adversaries and manipulate authorities into submission. The case of El Chapo is no different. When he started working for the Guadalajara cartel in the late 1970s, El Chapo became famous for his state-of-the-art tunnels. But he was also famous for his zero-tolerance policy on betrayers, and in his eyes, betrayers were anyone from an employee who didn't deliver the quotas to a police officer who didn't accept the cartel's bribes. El Chapo's zero-tolerance policy meant these men would get tortured and killed. To him, this was the only possible punishment. As the years went by, El Chapo established his own cartel, the Sinaloa, and made a name for himself as one of the most brutal men to walk this earth. In 2008, a video would emerge that would leave even the most seasoned detectives in utter shock. This was a man known as Israel Rincon Martinez, aka El Guacho.
Pues yo estoy con su hermano, le dijo, y con el señor. No, aquí que no va a estar aquí con el Chapo, con la prima, dijo. Aquí no va a estar con la prima, dijo. ¿Usted va a estar con mi hermano o no va a estar con nadie a la verga? Me dijo. Oiga, le dije, pero ¿por qué está pasando? Así como le estoy diciendo, me dijo, a la verga, dijo. O va a estar para acá con nosotros, o si no, diga de una vez, dijo.
Israel used to work for the Sinaloa cartel, but at the time, El Chapo was in an all-out war against the Beltran Leyva cartel. This was quite normal. Most of the time, cartels are fighting each other over turf, power, and smuggling routes. What's also normal is that sometimes sicarios change sides during the wars. This is what Israel did to El Chapo. This was the ultimate betrayal. Soon after learning about this, El Chapo had Israel kidnapped and taken to one of his hideouts. Israel would be subjected to some of the most vile torture imaginable. And what's worse, El Chapo was there watching along with his eldest sons. Indeed, Los Chapitos were groomed from a very young age into terrifying people. Rincon was electrocuted and his teeth were removed with pliers until he passed out. That's when a doctor intervened, reviving Israel so that he would feel every minute of torture. It was later revealed during a trial that this was one of El Chapo's standard torture procedures. He always had a doctor on his payroll, making sure his torture victims lived through all of the horrendous pain until their hearts gave in. Israel was tortured until he died, and it was all filmed and uploaded to spread fear online. Sinaloa's rivals had to know who they were messing with. This was happening in the late 2000s when El Chapo was on the run. He'd escaped from prison in Mexico in 2001, and he would hide in the mountains and lay low for 13 years until his 2014 arrest. However, El Chapo couldn't help but come and see his enemies get tortured and killed. This could only mean one thing: he enjoyed seeing others in pain. It was during his others trials that El Chapo's worst torture methods were revealed. In 2017, El Chapo stood trial in the United States for a plethora of charges. Among them were murder, money laundering, and of course, running Mexico's most powerful drug cartel. A long list of former Sinaloa members testified against him. Lastly, it was Memin's turn. Isaias Valdez Rios, also known as Memin, was the final cooperating witness called by the prosecution to testify against Guzman, the last of a parade of former friends, associates, and underlings to point a finger at Guzman since his trial began in November. Memin was El Chapo's guard for a long time before he decided to turn on him. His testimony against El Chapo was so graphic that Judge Brian Cogan once interrupted him, saying, "Could we have less narrative, please?" In 2006, El Chapo's men brought a rival cartel member to one of his mountain hideouts and interrogated him about his cartel. When he arrived at El Chapo's place, the man was already covered in burns made with a cigarette lighter and a clothing iron. El Chapo complained about his condition, then proceeded to put him on ice in a chicken coop and leave him there for days until his wounds began to fester. We told Mr. Joaquin that this man had a bad odor because he was decomposing in a way. Every now and then, El Chapo would ask him questions about his cartel. When the man didn't give an answer that El Chapo wanted to hear, El Chapo would shoot it, but not in a lethal area. Only after the man was more a zombie than a human being was El Chapo ready to kill him. He had Memin dig a hole and then dragged the prisoner to to the hole's edge. After asking him a bunch of questions, the man shot him and pushed him into the hole. The prisoner was still alive, gasping for air, when El Chapo's sicarios buried him, and El Chapo watched, proud of himself. A year later, El Chapo received a gift from his sicarios, 2 Los Zetas men. According to Memín, El Chapo personally beat them for hours until they were limp as rag dolls. They were completely limp like rag dolls. Their bones were totally broken. They could not move. And Mr. Joaquin still hitting them with a branch and his weapon too. Meanwhile, El Chapo had his sicarios prepare the men's deaths. Guzman ordered his men to dig a hole, Valdez said, and fill it with wood and get a fire going. Then, tying the Zetas to the back of 2 ATVs, they drove the prisoners to the edge of the pit, where the pistoleros had gotten a raging fire going, and dumped them on the ground. The men were conscious. They looked afraid. Guzman, holding an assault rifle, hopped off the ATV and put the shortened barrel of carbine to one Zetas' head and screamed, "A chingare tu madre," or "F your mother," Valdez said. El Chapo then pulled the trigger. Memín was paid about 2,000 Mexican pesos, the equivalent of $175 per week. In exchange for this sum, he slept on the ground at night, was on call 24/7, and stood guard while El Chapo conducted his shadiest business. Sometimes I hardly ate. Even when Mr. Joaquin would rest in his cabin, I would try to sort of rest, but I'd have a small radio with me and he'd say, "Memín, what did so-and-so say? Memín, say this to so-and-so." In January 2010, another story emerged, also when El Chapo was living on the run. Mexico's drug war reached new levels of brutality at the weekend when a gang member was killed and cut into 7 pieces as a warning to members of a cartel. To drive home the point, the victim's face was sliced off and stitched onto a football. The second day after New Year's, 36-year-old Hugo Hernandez was kidnapped from the Sonora state and taken to one of El Chapo's hideouts and torture houses. A few days later, his torso was found in a plastic container in Los Mochis. Another box had his arms, legs, and skull, but nothing compared to the sight City Hall workers were subjected to. Hernandez's face, sewn onto a football, was left in a plastic bag near City Hall. A note read, "Happy New Year's, because this will be your last." Reportedly, El Chapo had dismembered Hugo's body, removed his face, and stitched it to the football himself. This goes to show just how desensitized El Chapo is. He's not just a savvy businessman, he's also a monstrous criminal. But El Chapo didn't do the darkest bidding on his own all the time. During another ex-Sinaloa member's testimony, it was revealed that El Chapo often employed his trusted hitman, Jose Antonio Jaguar Marufo, to do the most brutal kind of torture. Once El Jaguar crashed a wedding only to kidnap the groom, his brother, and his uncle. All 3 men were found dead in the bed of an abandoned pickup truck a few days later. The groom was an American citizen, and this earned El Chapo yet another serious charge by the US. It's unknown what started the conflict between El Chapo and this groom, but it was serious enough for him to destroy his wedding and his family, and traumatize his poor wife for life. El Jaguar was an expert in kidnapping, torture, and murder, and he would always proudly display his mutilated corpses on the streets of Mexico so as to instill fear in his enemies. He would leave a banner stuck to the body, warning rival cartels not to mess with the Sinaloa, El Chapo, or El Jaguar. Creepily enough, El Jaguar had a specialized murder room in his own home, soundproof so that no one could hear the men scream or beg for their lives. He even tiled the room and put drains around it to make the post-murder cleanup easier. Yeah, these are the men that El Chapo trusted the most. In this world, the more violent you are, the more trustworthy for the cartel. Sadly, he imbued his own sons with this mentality too. In January 2023, El Chapo's son Ondeado was finally arrested for murder, money laundering, and trafficking tons of white powder, heroin, methamphetamines, and fentanyl.
Judy, they are known as Los Chapitos, the 4 most trusted sons of the world's most notorious drug kingpin. As the I-Team has reported for several years, federal drug investigators here in Chicago consider El Chapo's sons in charge of the Sinaloa cartel that remains this area's largest trafficker of heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamines.
Ondeado and his 3 brothers, Ivan, Jesus, and Alfredo, are considered the new leaders of the Sinaloa cartel, a separate faction from El Chapo's former buddy, El Mayo. Their dad might be in prison for the rest of his life, but since his arrest, Sinaloa cartel only made more money, and the crimes got even worse. According to government records, Los Chapitos is just as brutal as their dad.
Once information was obtained by these captives, typically through torture, these individuals were killed, either by or at the direction of the Chapitos themselves, and the bodies disposed of throughout the area. While many of these victims were shot, Others were fed dead or alive to tigers.
Indeed, Ivan and Alfredo own tigers, and it's safe to say they're not kept in ideal conditions either. As to the rivals they kidnap, well, they meet endings more gruesome than any horror movie can show. In 2017, two of El Chapo's sons kidnapped and murdered two Mexican federal police officers. The testimony was truly shocking.
For approximately 2 hours, members of the Ninis tortured victim 5 by inserting a corkscrew into victim 5's muscles, ripping it out of his muscles, and placing hot chilies in his open wounds and nose before being shot dead by Ivan Archibaldo Guzman Salazar.
Apparently, Los Chapitos' favorite torture methods include electrocution and waterboarding, and they do this to anyone: rival sicarios, police officers, and people who fail to pay debts. And to make matters worse, sometimes Los Chapitos test out the potency of their fentanyl on their prisoners. DEA Chief Ann Milgram said, "Death and destruction are central to their whole operation." The Sinaloa cartel is a network that fuels violence and death on both sides of the border. As a result of El Chapo and other kingpins like him, many people in Mexico live in constant fear. Some even lose their families in the horrific cartel wars.
Les digo a mis hijos, levántense, le digo, porque quién sabe qué está pasando en la calle. Digo, vístanse y nos salimos. Y todo empezó a tronar, ya no había luz, todo empezó a tronar, tanques, camionetas. Pero sí, ahí perdí a mis niños y a mi hija.
El Chapo and Ondeado are in prison, but his other sons and so many other business partners are still keeping the Sinaloa cartel up and running. And they do this with brutal torture methods, manipulation, bribery, and murder.
Do you consider yourselves kind of like terrorists?
No, nomás lo que hacemos, nada de otro tipo de acto contra la sociedad que esté mal.
A couple of days ago in Culiacan, a police officer was kidnapped. I suppose, to me, that seemed like acts of terrorism, you know, if you're kidnapping police.
Pues usted no sabe qué puede hacer el policía. Muchas veces un policía corrupto que hacen cosas indebidas. Pero alguna razón haber tenido para ese hecho, no, a nadie lo levanta nomás por puras ganas.
Meanwhile, other cartels like the Jalisco New Generation become even more brutal so that they stand a chance against the Sinaloa.
The most powerful is the Sinaloa cartel. Almost the 70% of the world is infected by this cartel.
It's hard to see an end to this brutality, and El Chapo is partially responsible for it.
Mexican drug lords are often laid to rest in places much more luxurious than most people's homes. One of the most extravagant mausoleums in a grand cemetery called Jardines del Jumaya in the state of Sinaloa houses the remains of one of Mexico's most infamous, violent, and vengeful drug lords, Manuel Torres Felix. This building costs about $340,000 and is decorated with Greco-Roman style columns complete with an alarm system, 24-hour air conditioning, and a fully equipped kitchen. How does someone rise to such infamy and wealth? This is the story of his climb to become one of the famous legends of Mexican cartels. How does a simple man from a small village become one of the most feared and deadly hitmen in the underground world of drug trafficking? What happened to him to cause the complete and utter unraveling of his sanity? How did he meet his eventual demise? Manuel Torres Felix was born in a tiny town of about 8,000 people called Cosala in Sinaloa. By the time he was in his 30s, he had begun working for the notorious Sinaloa cartel, also known as the Blood Alliance due to the fact that most of the cartel's members are related through blood or marriage. The Sinaloa cartel is the strongest and most prominent drug cartel in the world. What began as a coalition of agricultural families became the #1 drug trafficking operation, starting in the 1960s with marijuana, and then branching out into cocaine and eventually heroin and meth when they saw a rise in its demand. One of the reasons for the cartel's great success is that it does not function as a traditional hierarchy, but instead as separate groups that protect one another. This way, even though one of its most well-known leaders, Joaquin Guzman, known as El Chapo, was arrested and extradited to the US, the cartel is still flourishing.
Guzman has been indicted by grand juries in 6 states, and the U.S. aggressively urged the Mexican government to send him here to face charges in an American courtroom.
Torres' older brother, Javier Torres Felix, was already well established in the Sinaloa cartel by the time Manuel got involved. Javier was a protege of Juan Manuel Salcido Uteza, known as El Cochiloco, meaning crazy pig.
Cochiloco, una persona pues que ganó mucho dinero, que tuvo muchas propiedades allá en Sinaloa, acá en Guadalajara también, hoteles.
Salcido lived a double life as a generous and friendly rancher in Coquimatlan in the state of Colima, even befriending the state's governor, Elias Zamora Verduzco. When El Cochiloco was killed in 1991 after he stole 8 tons of cocaine from Colombian drug traffickers, his identity was revealed to the shocked people who had grown to admire the man, who did things like provide uniforms for local kids' sports teams and help get roads paved. Zamora, the governor, said he did not feel bad about his friendship with the man he discovered was one of the leaders of the Sinaloa cartel. After Salcedo's death, Manuel's older brother Javier Torres Felix, or JT, began working under Ismael El Mayo Zambada, one of the cartel's most violent and powerful leaders, who up until this day remains the only member of Mexico's list of most wanted drug lords to elude arrest. That was not the case for Javier Torres Felix, who was arrested and released multiple times. In 2001, after another prison stint of Javier's, a hit on the brothers Javier and Manuel Torres Felix was attempted, supposedly by Ramon Arellano Felix, a leader in the Tijuana cartel. However, the gunmen were unsuccessful, so instead they took out their violence on the townspeople of the brothers' birthplace of Cosala, killing 12 people. During a traffic stop by police officer Angel Antonio Arias Torres, Ramon Arellano Felix was killed by a single gunshot to the head after firing at Arias Torres, who died immediately after shooting Arellano. Rumor had it that El Chapo himself had ordered Arias Torres to make the traffic stop in order to kill Arellano. Eventually, after the 2004 arrest of Javier Torres Felix and his later extradition to the U.S., the younger brother Manuel Fidel Torres Felix replaced Javier as El Mayo's right-hand man, working alongside Oviedo Guzman, the son of El Chapo. Soon he was responsible for moving drugs from South America to the U.S. First nicknamed ML1, Torres was renowned for his cold-bloodedness and violent tendencies. The Mexican drug cartels are no strangers to murder, torture, and physical beatings in order to keep their various trafficking operations, which can branch out from drugs into other things like guns and even sometimes human beings. But Torres was especially sinister, sometimes to the point of pure sadistic cruelty. One of the people Torres worked closely with was Alfredo Beltran Leyva, or El Mochomo, which means desert ant. Beltran was one of the 5 brothers, including himself, Arturo, Alberto, Carlos, and Hector Beltran Leyva. When Alfredo was arrested in 2008, his brothers blamed El Chapo and decided to break away from the Sinaloa cartel to create their own organization, which became known as the Beltran Leyva cartel. Arturo Beltran Leyva, known as El Barbas, in particular, had a vendetta against the Sinaloa cartel. This began a rivalry that would erupt again and again in bloody violence and death. What happened after this between the Sinaloa cartel and the Beltran Leyva cartel is what would eventually earn Manuel with the nickname El Ondeado, which means something like the Twisted One, although it's more often translated as the Crazy One.
When he is mentioned, the new members of the Caldero de Sinaloa show their kind of admiration towards the criminal recognized as one of the fiercest adversaries of the Beltran Leyva brothers.
Because the Torres Felix brothers had worked so closely with El Chapo, the Beltran Leyva cartel naturally thought of them as prime targets for their vengeance. One of the first attacks on Manuel Torres Felix's family happened when his nephew Joel Torres Jimenez, the son of his older brother Javier, was assaulted at a billiards hall. Joel Torres would go on to narrowly escape death 3 times. But much worse than that was the attack that resulted on the murder of El Ondeado's son, Anastasio Torres Acosta, El Taquio, and the shooting injury of his sister-in-law, Sandra Rivas Heredia, and his 4-year-old daughter Alondra, whose arm had been amputated after the shooting. It was April 18, 2008, and Anastasio was out for drive in a Montalbano neighborhood of Culiacan with Sandra and Alondra when his car was ambushed by an armed convoy of members of the Beltran Leyva cartel. In the exchange of gunfire that followed, Anastasio was fatally injured and Sandra and Alondra both hit. A note left at the scene of the shooting attack said, "On behalf of your friend Arturo and his nephews Los Zetas, so you can understand, Manuel Torres." It was supposedly written on behalf of Arturo Beltran Leyva, El Barbas. The grief and rage that followed for Manuel Torres Felix is said to have driven him mad, and he no longer cared who he hurt or killed in his quest for revenge. Rumor had it that as he mourned his son, he put a hit out on anyone and everyone who may have been connected to the Beltran Leyva cartel and may have had anything to do with the death of his son and the grave injury of his daughter.
El M1 went into a mix of rage and painful grief over losing his son Tachio. It was that day when he found out about his son's death that he lost his mind.
A few months after the attack, 2 men were discovered at the same spot, one inside a barrel with his head removed, and the other wrapped in a canvas with his thumb removed and an orange bow tied to his body. These orange bows were found on many other corpses found around the same time. There was a note attached to the man in the barrel claiming that the 2 were hitmen of Arturo Beltran Leyva's, who were killed in order to teach respect for my children. 5 more corpses were found at the same location that very week. Most of the bodies had notes attached that seemed clearly to be for Manuel Torres Felix. Then on July 4th, 2008, a call was made to local police to report the discovery of a mysterious red sedan parked on the roadside. Inside the open trunk were several bodies, mutilated, decapitated, stuffed into plastic bags. One of the bodies was that of former commander of the state police unit, whose entire body had been torn apart, his limbs in one bag, head in another, and torso in another. Another one was placed next to the body of a snake. Reportedly, El Ondeado had tortured any man connected to his son's death in their own home. A note was left that said, "For you to keep in mind, Arturo Beltran Leyva, from El Ondeado. If you're such a man, let's meet man to man. This goes to you, or your dog-eating, child-killing, police-killing chatos. You better shoot yourself. Stop doing these infamous acts. All of you together are too little for me alone." Some people say that over 200 deaths occurred in the weeks following El Tacho's slaying. Later that year, in September, the army raided a ranch used by narcos and seized guns and ammunition. They also found a photo of ML1 and his nephew, Misael Torres Urea, known as M2. This photo basically went viral and appears in many stories, videos, and music videos about Torres. El Ondeado's deathly feud with Arturo Beltran Leyva was cut short with the death of Beltran. On December 11, 2009, Mexican authorities invaded Beltran's home in the middle of a lavish Christmas party, where even a Grammy-winning Latino musician was a guest. 3 gunmen were killed, but Beltran escaped. However, 5 days later, on December 16th, the same day that the heads of 6 police investigators were found impaled on a display in Durango, Beltran was located in a luxury hideout south of Mexico City. Over 200 officials invaded to capture him. In the ensuing gun battle, Beltran was fatally shot and killed. 3 other members of the Beltran cartel were killed, and another man jumped to his death in an apparent suicide. During that battle, a Marine named Mels Cadet Anglo Cordova was killed. Afterwards, he was awarded the highest military awards possible at a well-publicized and glorious funeral. But merely hours later, almost his entire family, his mother, sister, brother, and aunt, was slaughtered in an act of revenge. El Ondeado finally met his end in a showdown with the Mexican government on October 13, 2012. After his death, the Mexican government claimed that they had dealt a damaging blow to the Sinaloa cartel. Although due to the non-hierarchical nature of the cartel, the effects of his death were hard to measure. It did show that the government was willing to go after the cartel's members, though, which may have struck fear in some of them. In the days following his death, flags and signs known as narconatos, or narco banners, started appearing around the town of Culiacan, placing blame upon El Mayo himself and claiming he had set up his own lieutenant to be killed. El Ondeado is so famous, and in fact honored and respected in some ways, perhaps for his relentlessness in avenging the death of his son, that he is the subject of many narcos corridos, songs that tell the stories of various drug traffickers and their exploits. In these controversial songs, narcos are often elevated to an almost heroic status, as Robin Hood-like figures opposing the government. One such song, which celebrates M1's love for Hummers and AK-47s, contains the following lyrics. These days, El Mayo still holds a high position, although his health is reportedly declining. What will happen next to the Sinaloa cartel remains to be seen, but it's indisputable that the violent reign of terror of Manuel Torres Felix is one of the most famous chapters of the cartel's history.
Tonight, the DEA is offering $10 million for information leading to the arrest of the Mexican drug kingpin known as El Mencho.
If you think death is the worst thing that can happen to a person, think again.
If El Mencho wants you to work for him, you have 2 options. Say yes or be killed.
Because the fate that El Cholo suffered at the hands of El Mencho and the CJNG was worse than death. The final days of his life were filled with immeasurable agony. The manner of his demise was sickening, and the details of how he died will make your stomach turn. In fact, it's safe to say that when death eventually came for the man, it was an act of mercy. Who was El Cholo, and what did he do to deserve his terrible fate? The cruel, cold CJNG cartel. Before we dive into who El Cholo is, we first need to address the organization and the individual he betrayed, Jalisco New Generation Cartel, otherwise known as the CJNG. If you are familiar with this cartel, then you know that no one in their right minds would willingly betray this insane, violent criminal outfit. And yet, El Cholo did. In fact, he didn't just cross some low-level underlinings of the cartel. He betrayed the boss himself, the fearsome and infamous El Mencho. Once again, if you know nothing about this man, then use this as an introduction. El Mencho is the devil, plain and simple.
Tú ya sabes con quién traes la bronca. Para que sepas, aquí seguimos buscándote y no quitaremos el dedo del renglón.
Go ask anyone who runs the most brutal cartel. No, who runs the most brutal criminal organization in the world. They will point to El Mencho and his CJNG. Under his guidance, the organization has committed crimes that would make the skin of ISIS terrorist organizations crawl. Because it's not so much what crimes they commit, it's how they commit these crimes. And the ridiculous part is, they're not even half as big as the Sinaloa cartel or any of the rival cartels in the country. They're small, and yet, despite their diminutive size, they are the first and so far the only cartel to take on the Mexican government and technically win. Beyond this, they are known for their willingness to use weapons in warfare and their battles against practically anyone who stands in their way. There's a rumor, probably true, that they once tried to buy a belt-fed M60 machine gun in the US, and they've gone on record as the first cartel to bring down a Mexican military helicopter with a rocket-propelled grenade. If all this sounds impressive to you, it shouldn't. There's nothing pretty about this cartel, because when you consider how they treat their victims, including the civilians that they kidnap, it will knock the taste out of your mouth. Legend has it that CJNG recruits cannibalize their victims during the initiation process. Children, pregnant women, the elderly, no one is too innocent or too precious to be violated. They've assassinated more government officials than anyone is willing to acknowledge, and there is no doubt that they were behind the assassination of Aristotle Sandoval, the former governor of Jalisco, back in December 2020. All of this chaos, all of this bloodshed, every hit and every kill is sanctioned by El Mencho, the man that El Cholo betrayed, the same man whom, surprisingly, was El Cholo's boss and closest friend. The path to rebellion. El Mencho started from nothing, born into poverty and making a living for himself through grit, determination, and both feet in the drug trade. He wouldn't meet El Cholo until he became a sicario for the now defunct Milenio cartel. At the time, they both protected the drug lord Armando Valencia Cornelio, alias El Maradona, and it was during this time that El Cholo became something of El Mencho's right-hand man. He was there when El Mencho tried to hold the Milenio cartel together as their bosses either got arrested, died violently, or both. El Cholo witnessed El Mencho reorganize the cartel and rename it to the CJNG, filling the gap that the Milenio cartel left. With El Mencho in charge, everyone fell in line. He had a quality that his dead bosses recognized, admired, and employed him for. But it was also the same quality he had used to take some of them out. And it was a quality that would spell a new age of chaos and violence for the state of Mexico. On one hand, El Mencho was materialistic, disciplined, and thoroughly organized. On the other hand, he was violent, brash, and crude with his techniques. It was this unique ability to be those two things at the same time that struck fear of God in the hearts of his enemies. For example, most cartels have the habit of making their victims disappear. The Sinaloa cartel famously had El Pozolero, a stew maker, who, for more than a decade, dissolved thousands of bodies in acid for the Sinaloa cartel, essentially causing tens of thousands of people to disappear. But El Mencho encouraged his cartel to do the exact opposite. Every corpse presented an opportunity for spectacle. Instead of making bodies disappear, they would butcher them and throw them in public streets or hang them from bridges while recording the process. They would then post it on social media for the world to see. El Cholo was at the center of these activities. He knew firsthand what El Mencho was capable of because he was the one who carried out most of his hits for him. In fact, when El Mencho seized power of the CJNG in 2011, he became the boss's personal sicario. And maybe this is why he betrayed him. He had gotten so close to the man in charge that he lost perspective. El Mencho was a hard man, a man who gave answers and expected you to follow without question. But El Cholo was a man with his own ideas. He wasn't a yes man. And it was only a matter of time before those ideas became seeds of rebellion. And in the world of cartels, the wages of rebellion is death. Soon enough, El Cholo began doing things he shouldn't do. His first act of rebellion came when he conducted hits without El Mencho's permission. El Mencho was, and still is, a strategic man, and he wouldn't have appreciated the gesture. It didn't take long for a loyalist named Marcos Hernandez, the cartel's financial operator, to snitch on El Cholo. El Mencho was furious at El Cholo. and El Cholo was furious at Marcos. However, the situation wasn't irredeemable, and there was a possibility that El Mencho would have forgiven his erring Sicario if El Cholo had simply asked for forgiveness. But you see, El Cholo was on a path of self-destruction. He assassinated Marcos and essentially declared war on his former boss. Rather than making amends with El Mencho, El Cholo defected, took men from CJNG with him, and went ahead to form his own cartel, Nueve Plaza Cartel. The Cartel Civil War. El Cholo's betrayal dealt a heavy blow to the CJNG. El Cholo took a handful of CJNG generals with him, including the CJNG's head of logistics, Eric Valencia Salazar, aka L85. There's no telling exactly how El Mencho felt about the exodus of betrayal that happened, but I can tell you what happened next. El Mencho declared war, ordered a hit on El Cholo, and began attacking his Nueve cartel, attempting to cut it down before it could ever become a real threat. But these were his former men and colleagues. It's safe to say that they already knew his tricks. First of all, the declaration of war didn't faze El Cholo one bit. Secondly, the attempt on his life by El Mencho's hit squad failed miserably. It was so bad that El Cholo murdered the head of the hit squad sent after him, undermining his former boss once again. The war that followed was brutal enough as it was, but somehow it was about to get a lot worse. Because El Cholo formed an alliance with the enemy, the Sinaloa cartel. With this alliance, they quickly found access to resources that allowed them to level the playing field. Now, they could fight the CJNG on their own terms. Now it was all fair play. The Sinaloa cartel began using El Cholo's Nueve cartel as a hit squad that was mostly targeted at the CJNG. They even allowed them to take control of important sections of the Jalisco territory and some of Mexico's western states. The war that was tipping in El Cholo's favor. It was beginning to look like El Mencho would be defeated by his former Sicario. The war that broke out was brutal and extensive, and unluckily for residents living there, Guadalajara was the stage of it all. And as both factions fought their bitter battle, innocent people were caught in the crossfire. In 2018, 3 film students in Guadalajara were driving home from school when members of the CJNG kidnapped and killed them after confusing them for members of the Nueve cartel. Public buses were set on fire, broad day shootouts were routinely conducted, and the body count kept on rising until the entire city was filled with the stench of corpses and the fear of its residents. Meanwhile, El Cholo just kept on getting stronger and stronger. Whatever El Mencho was doing was not working. However, just when El Cholo seemed like he had won both the battle and the war, the worst thing happened. On March 18, 2021, El Cholo was captured by armed members of the CJNG on the orders of El Mencho himself. In the video, you can see him sitting calmly flanked on all sides by armed sicarios as he delivers a confession. My name is Carlos Enrique Sanchez Martinez, aka El Cholo. I am originally from Guadalajara, Jalisco. I'm here because I'm an enemy of CJNG. I met with Omar Garcia Harfuch in the federal district so that he could give me his backing. This is due to us both being after the CJNG, and he did give me his full support, but he told me that he needed something relevant in return so that I could operate with his support and his people among the city. The Omar Garcia that El Cholo implicated in this confession happened to be the sitting Mexico City police chief at the time. But it didn't end there. El Cholo rounded it off with a warning. Anyone that is still left supporting me, it's best for your own good to just start taking care of your families so that you don't end up like me. No one needs to tell you who wrote the confession, but the message was properly received. The individuals and officials he revealed immediately began to defend themselves. Omar Garcia Harfuch refuted the claims in a tweet. Regarding a video in which a criminal kidnapped by other criminals made comments about me, I reiterate that I will not be distracted by false messages from criminals. My commitment to society is firm. Fight crime to be the last consequences. All of the other public law officers he mentioned in the clip were fired. This was El Cholo's downfall, and he had taken his allies down with him. After this video, the sicarios behind him proceeded to extend his torture over the course of a few days. This is an image of El Cholo before the CJNG captured him, and this is what he looked like just a few hours into his torture. El Cholo's gruesome death. 2 days. That's how long El Cholo was tortured. It's unclear where the Sicario started from, but the common knowledge is that he was kept alive for the full length of those 48 hours while he was pushed into the very edge of what anyone should endure. First, his legs were destroyed. All the bones were broken. and shattered into bits. Then, the toes on his feet were chopped to bits, and the toes they missed were grinded. His broken ribs suggested that it had been smashed in. And this is where the whole situation becomes confusing, because no one is sure whether all of this was done before, during, or after his body was savagely slashed and his eyes were gouged out. And did I mention he was also electrocuted? But while everything I just mentioned is incredibly horrifying, none of it comes close to what happened next. Still alive, while still breathing, El Cholo's tongue was clamped in a vise and pulled viciously out of his mouth. It was only after this that he was shot twice in the head. His body, or at least what was left of it, was wrapped in a plastic bag and dropped on a public bench in true CJ&G fashion. So how did the Sinaloa cartel respond? They said nothing, did nothing. What about his cartel, the Nueve cartel, and his buddy Salazar? Same, said nothing, did nothing. El Mencho had promised everyone who betrayed him that he would send a message. El Cholo's death was received by everyone, hand-delivered, unmistakable, clear as day. Since then, no one has dared to cross El Mencho like El Cholo did, and from the looks of it, it seems like no one will anytime soon.